What if everything you thought you knew about MASH's cancellation was wrong? The tears, the finale, the epic goodbye, all of it made it feel like a show ripped away too soon. But MASH didn't just get cancelled. It ended on its own terms after 11 wildly successful seasons. So why do so many fans still believe something darker happened behind the scenes? Well, tonight, we're digging into how the most subversive war comedy in TV history snuck its punches past the gatekeepers and got away with killing, all under the camouflage of laughter. Let's kick things off with a script so provocative, CBS didn't just tweak it, they banned it outright. And no, it wasn't about the horrors of war or political dissent. It was about sex. More precisely, Hawkeye's sex life. The script that crossed the line. In 1972, right in the middle of MASH's first season, the writers submitted a script called Hawkeye on the Double. The plot was cheeky, even for Hawkeye. He was juggling two nurses, one during the day, one at night, without either of them knowing about the other. Classic sitcom setup, right? But the twist took things to another level. When the nurses eventually discovered his two-timing, they teamed up to get revenge in the most dramatic way possible. They both claimed he had gotten them pregnant. Not one, both. And just like any cooperate, CBS's first reaction was to shut it down. According to Larry Gelbart, who helped create the show, this was the one and only script that CBS said, under no circumstances will you be able to do this. And that's saying something, considering this is the same network that let them air episodes about battlefield amputations, military corruption, and soldiers losing their minds under pressure. But here, in a story centered more around bedroom antics than battlefield trauma, the network balked. CBS said the episode leaned too hard into the dalliance and too far away from the anti-war tone that gave MASH its weight. Basically, it was too spicy for a prime-time audience in the early 70s. And the message from the network was clear. We'll let you question military authority, but don't mess with the morality clause when it comes to... Now, the wildest part is that Hawkeye's romantic life wasn't exactly squeaky clean in other episodes. He flirted, he charmed, and he occasionally got lucky. So what made this one different? Well, it wasn't just about romance. It was about the consequence. The idea of two women banding together and using pregnancy, real or fake, as payback. That was pushing way too many buttons in 1972. You could almost hear the censors scrambling to grab the red pens. For Larry Gelbart, though, this rejection didn't deflate him. It actually did the opposite. He later admitted that having this script blocked pushed the writers to get smarter, sharper, and more creative in how they tackled controversial material. Instead of overt scenes, they learned how to sneak powerful ideas in through subtext, humor, and irony. They couldn't just hit the audience over the head anymore. They had to slide their commentary under the radar, and it made the show better. Now, the banned script didn't just disappear into the Hollywood vault. It ended up being included in the MASH, Martinis and Medicine collection. DVD box set years later. Fans finally got a peek at the episode CBS tried to bury. And yeah, it's every bit as bold as you'd expect. So, what do you think? Would you have aired this script back in '72? Or did CBS actually have a point? Now, let's break down how this tiny act of rebellion slipped past one of history's most tightly controlled TV sets. The F-bomb hidden for 40 years. Decades before HD remasters and ultra-clear screens, the writers of MASH pulled off a cheeky little stunt that flew completely under the radar. Yes, we're talking about a profane Easter egg hiding in plain sight, and nobody noticed for 40 years. That's right, long before streaming or binge-watching with pause buttons, the censors didn't catch it. The episode in question is The Trial of Henry Blake from Season 2, originally aired back in 1974. You might remember it as one of those classic MASH moments, mixing sharp humor with serious themes. But here's the kicker. Somewhere in the chaos, the character Trapper John left a note that read, "Give the guard a F-gallon." Yeah, the actual F word, just casually written on a piece of paper. Now, try imagining this on 1970s primetime network TV. It was basically the kind of thing that could get a show canceled instantly. CBS was notoriously strict about profanity, especially back then. One curse word was enough to trigger a full-on panic. But here's where it gets wild. For decades, that line was practically invisible, buried deep enough in the set dressing and fuzzy old broadcast quality that no one really saw it. It was a secret message, an inside joke for the writers and the most eagle-eyed fans. Then suddenly, in 2024, when the MASH* episodes got remastered in high definition, that hidden note jumped off the screen in crystal clarity. Viewers were stunned to discover this tiny act of defiance that had gone unnoticed for so long. CBS had rules that were basically carved in stone. No profanity, no overt sexual content, and absolutely no direct criticism of the military or government. Yet this cheeky little phrase was daring the censors to catch it. And somehow, it slipped through. It's the perfect example of the cat-and-mouse game between network executives and MASH's rebellious writers. The show was a masterclass in subtle subversion, always towing the line but never quite crossing it. Or so the network thought. The writer's choice to sneak in that word was a quiet middle finger to the system, a wink to anyone paying attention. Larry Gelbart and his team knew how far they could push without getting axed. It's that tension between creative freedom and corporate censorship that made MASH* so iconic, not just for its stories, but for the way it challenged the establishment while pretending to play by its rules. So, if you rewatch The Trial of Henry Blake now, with this knowledge, did you spot the note before? Bet most people didn't. This hidden F-bomb is just one example of how TV history is full of little secrets waiting to be uncovered. And it raises the bigger question. How many other forbidden jokes and lines slipped past the censors? But hold up. This wasn't the only rule they broke. The next bit of MASH lore is even crazier. Wait until you hear the joke that somehow made it on air despite CBS's ironclad policies. Trust me, you're gonna want to stick around for that one. Sexual innuendo that fooled censors. It was just another day in the 4077th, or so it seemed. Hawkeye Pierce, who was always about 2 seconds away from his next wisecrack, was rifling through someone's belongings when he casually dropped a line that, in retrospect, feels like it should have set off alarm bells across the CBS network. He held up an item and quipped, "Is this Margaret's vibrator?" Simple, quick, and completely inappropriate, if you caught the joke. But here's the kicker. No one did. At the time, CBS's censorship department had a pretty straightforward mission: cut anything remotely profane or politically inflammatory before it ever reached living rooms in Middle America. This was the early 1970s. The word vibrator wasn't supposed to slip into primetime sitcoms, not even whispered, let alone tossed into a joke and broadcast nationally. Yet, somehow, there it was. Not only aired, but rerun. Again and again. Because no one at CBS caught it. So, how did a vibrator joke make it through one of the most tightly wound censorship machines in network history? It all comes down to language, specifically slang. The suits at CBS weren't exactly fluent in double entendre, and they definitely weren't up to date on euphemisms. So when Larry Gelbart, the razor-sharp showrunner behind MASH, decided to slip in a little innuendo, he knew exactly how to do it. In his own words, the trick was making it sound medical. The moment you wrapped a dirty joke in sterile, clinical phrasing or delivered it fast enough to blend into background chatter, it could float right past the radar. And that's exactly what happened. The vibrator line wasn't even the only time this tactic worked. In another infamous scene, Frank Burns, an uptight character who made freshly ironed shirts look rumpled, says he prefers a snug harbor. On its face, that sounds innocent, maybe even poetic. But in context, it was a thinly veiled reference to female anatomy, the kind of thing that would have caused a small explosion in the CBS compliance office. If only someone had caught it. But once again, nobody did. Either they didn't get the joke or assumed it meant something else entirely. And Gelbart? He just kept smirking from the writer's room. What's wild is that MASH didn't rely on these innuendos as one-off shock gags. They were part of a bigger strategy. The show constantly tested the limits of what network television could get away with, not just in terms of language but subject matter, tone, and structure. And the way Gelbart and his team saw it, if they could sneak in a risque line and make the censors miss it, it would have been a win for creative freedom. A quiet rebellion, in other words. The audience, though, was a different story. Many viewers, especially younger ones watching reruns decades later, finally picked up on the hidden meanings, with changing slang, better context, and, let's be honest, the ability to pause and rewind. People started realizing just how cheeky some of those lines really were, and the discovery made MASH all the more brilliant. It wasn't just a war comedy. It was a subversive masterclass in getting around the rules. Now, think back to your favorite MASH episode. Was there a joke that made you do a double take? Maybe one you didn't fully get until years later? Because in a show about surgeons dodging bombs and bureaucracy, nothing felt more dangerous or more satisfying than slipping something past the censors. But not every battle ended with a win. One particular storyline hit so hard that CBS shut it down before it even aired. What was it? And why did it strike such a nerve? The unpatriotic storyline CBS buried. Soldiers faking illness just to get sent home? CBS took one look at that and said, absolutely not. Not on their watch, not during wartime, and definitely not on one of the biggest shows in American television. What was pitched as a single episode became so radioactive that it never even saw a camera lens. But the idea behind it was real and perhaps a little too true for primetime comfort. Let's rewind to the early 1970s. While Vietnam was still raging with protests on the streets and campuses, CBS was walking a tightrope between entertainment and controversy. During a time when Larry Gelbart was the show's genius head writer and developer, the man who believed comedy could challenge power and poke holes in war narratives without losing its heart. Gelbart floated the idea of a storyline where soldiers, desperate to get out of the war zone, deliberately expose themselves to the freezing cold so they can get sick, bad enough to be sent home. That's not a joke or a punchline. That was the pitch. No enemy fire or dramatic battlefield injuries. Just a brutally honest look at what some soldiers would actually resort to when they were mentally and physically done. And that's exactly what made it too dangerous. CBS's response, however, was an obvious nope. Not even close. The idea was canned before it reached the writer's room in any official capacity. And, to be fair, from a corporate perspective, they were terrified. The country was already split. The network didn't want to become the face of the so-called anti-war agenda. And showcasing American soldiers faking illness to escape duty? That would have triggered accusations of treason from living rooms coast to coast. At the time, MASH was already towing the line with its satire. It was technically set during the Korean War, but absolutely nobody missed the Vietnam parallels. So when this idea came up, soldiers intentionally making themselves sick to go home, it crossed an invisible line. It didn't just question the war, it questioned patriotism. And for CBS, that wasn't just uncomfortable, that was dangerous. But here's the part they didn't count on. The truth doesn't always vanish just because you lock the script in a drawer. What does a soldier owe his country when he's already given everything? This tension between the network's fear and the writer's persistence ended up shaping the DNA of MASH more than that single storyline ever could have. The show became a masterclass in slipping real commentary past the censors. They couldn't show soldiers standing in snowbanks to catch pneumonia. Still, they could show them cracking under the weight of a senseless war. They could show Hawkeye going numb. They could show trappers scheming. They could even make the laugh track feel like static. It's wild to think that one of the most respected shows in television history was once one unpatriotic plot twist away from cancellation. And yet, what's even wilder? The biggest controversy MASH ever stirred wasn't the one that got buried. It was the one that aired front and center. You might already know where this is heading: the finale. That last episode, which didn't shy away from trauma or loss, became the most watched television broadcast in American history. Over 105 million people tuned in, more than the Super Bowl, more than any election coverage. So you've got to ask, did CBS dodge a bullet by shelving that storyline, or did they miss an opportunity to tell the most honest story the show could ever tell? Would it have changed public opinion, or pulled more threads on the lie of romanticized war? Or maybe, just maybe, it would have made a few viewers angry enough to write letters and a few others quiet enough to start thinking. And now we dive into something even more controversial. Not the episode CBS buried, but the one that turned into a cultural juggernaut. The most watched episode in American television history, and it almost didn't happen. The finale's traumatic twist. There is a moment in television history that still causes people to pause mid-sentence, shake their heads slowly, and say, "Wait, did that really happen on MASH?" The series finale of MASH, titled Goodbye, Farewell, and Amen, aired in 1983 and was seen by over 106 million people. In essence, more Americans watched that single episode than voted in some presidential elections. But one scene in particular left viewers stunned and scarred even. Now, picture this. Hawkeye, the wisecracking surgeon who had held it together through 11 seasons of carnage and chaos, is sitting across from psychiatrist Sidney Friedman. His face is hollow, haunted, no longer the life of the operating room. As the story unravels, we learn the truth behind his mental collapse. On a bus ride with a group of Korean refugees, he had insisted that a woman silence her chicken because its clucking could give away their position. Only it wasn't a chicken, it was her baby, and she smothered it. This was the moment the trauma buried under years of sarcasm and surgical adrenaline surfaced. And fans weren't ready. Many still aren't. People still talk about The Sopranos' cut to black or Walter White's final fall, but nothing in primetime comedy went there quite like MASH did that night. The reaction was divisive. Some hailed the scene as a bold, unflinching look at psychological damage. Others thought the show had gone too far. It was too dark, too real even. And in the years that followed, a myth quietly formed, a whisper among fans. The finale was too much, they'd say. It got the show canceled. But here's where we pump the brakes and check the facts. MASH* was not canceled. It ended on its own terms. It was one of the few shows in TV history to bow out at the height of its power. The writers, producers, and cast knew it was time. 11 seasons, 256 episodes, countless surgeries, jokes, and heartbreaks later, they wanted a send-off that mattered. They wanted closure. And the baby scene? That was the emotional climax. The unraveling of Hawkeye's mind mirrored the unraveling of the war around him. But just because a show ends on its own terms doesn't mean the public gets the memo. So why do people still believe MASH was canceled because of that scene? It's the power of narrative. It feels true. It feels like the kind of twist Hollywood would pull. But the truth is less dramatic and way more interesting. The finale wasn't about shocking the audience. It was about honoring the emotional reality of war. Hawkeye was the lens through which we laughed, cried, and endured. And in those final moments, he was stripped bare. Still, viewer backlash was real. Letters poured in. Critics questioned the tone. Was it still a comedy if you made people weep like that? And that's the real question, isn't it? Was this scene too dark for a comedy? MASH asterisk was never just a comedy. It was a Trojan horse. Underneath the jokes about spam and latrines was a show that asked hard questions about war, morality, and human cost. That finale wasn't a departure from its tone. It was the final reveal. The last mask is falling. And yet, here we are, decades later, still whispering about the baby on the bus, and still wondering if the show crossed a line or just told the truth too clearly. Either way, it stuck. It changed what television could do, what it could say. And for a show that started as a laugh track sitcom, that's one hell of a legacy. So why do some people still say MASH was canceled? The Aftermash cancellation conspiracy. If you thought MASH went out with a bang, you are not alone. Its final episode, Goodbye, Farewell and Amen, aired in 1983. It pulled in over 100 million viewers, becoming the most watched scripted TV broadcast in U.S. history. That finale felt so final that it practically engraved itself into pop culture. But MASH didn't really end. Not completely. It continued, just not in a way anyone talks about. Because 2 years later, CBS tried to ride the wave a little longer. They launched Aftermash, a spin-off that picked up with Colonel Potter, Klinger, and Father Mulcahy. They are now back in the States, working at a veterans hospital. The war was over. The laughter was thinner. But the stakes? Less bloody, but somehow more emotionally convoluted. And the audiences were not buying it. Now, here's where it gets suspicious. On the surface, Aftermash failed because it aired opposite the A-Team. And let's be real, trying to compete with Mr. T and explosions per minute television was a lost cause from the jump. Viewership plummeted in Season 2. What started as a decent ratings grab quickly turned into a broadcast slow-motion car crash. And CBS, clearly not in the mood for a prolonged embarrassment, pulled the plug before the last episode could air. And that final episode had a name. Wet Feet. Never heard of it? Yeah, that's not your fault. Wet Feet never aired in the United States. For 30 years, this episode was a ghost, whispered about by hardcore fans, but otherwise invisible to the public eye. So what happened inside Wet Feet? Why did CBS freeze it out? Here's what we know. The episode centers on Klinger, who gets cold feet about a second marriage after his first ended in heartbreak. It's not a wild premise. In fact, it sounds pretty standard. Emotional, a little sad, kind of bittersweet. Nothing about it screams controversial on the surface. But the surrounding circumstances? Ratings were in free fall. and CBS wanted a clean break. But others, particularly modern YouTubers and digital sleuths, think something deeper was happening. They point out how Aftermash started to lean into more serious post-war trauma themes just as audiences were tuning out. Mental health in veterans, PTSD, bureaucratic failure in the VA system. These weren't just punchlines, they were indictments, and perhaps CBS, feeling the heat from advertisers or government pressure, didn't want its quirky little sitcom to dig that deep into America's dirty laundry. And here's where it gets even murkier. In the internet age, clips from Aftermash started resurfacing, sometimes mashed up or mislabeled. Some content creators on YouTube began mixing wet feet with scenes from MASH's actual finale, spinning conspiracy theories that CBS hid the real ending of MASH because it was too raw. You get thumbnails like, "The band MASH ending CBS buried," or "This scene was so dark, it killed the franchise." But that's not true. Wet Feet wasn't MASH. It was the epilogue to a sequel that most people didn't even know existed. And yet, that conspiracy still holds power, maybe because it scratches a deeper itch. That sense we all have that something wasn't quite resolved. That MASH, for all its humor and heart, never truly let us process the psychological cost of war. So, Aftermash, and especially Wet Feet, became the scapegoat. Or maybe the sacrificial lamb. Something had to take the blame for the silence that followed. When Wet Feet finally aired in 2016, 3 decades after being shelved, the reaction was surprisingly emotional. Viewers weren't angry. It was more like watching a memory get dusted off and put on display. It wasn't groundbreaking, but haunting in a quiet, slow-burning way. You felt it. So here's the real question. Was Wet Feet buried because it was bad TV, or because it hit too close to home? Have you seen Aftermash? Be honest. Did it deserve all the hate, or was it ahead of its time in all the wrong ways? The untold cat and mouse game. Here's the real scandal. MASH outsmarted CBS for a decade. While everyone else was laughing at Hawkeye's wisecracks and Radar's teddy bear, the show's writers were staging a quiet little rebellion against television's biggest gatekeepers. And CBS? They didn't even catch half of it. Because behind the wacky surgeries and canned laughter, the MASH writers were playing a long game. A sly, surgical game of cat and mouse, with network censors that was anything but accidental. Let's start with the basics. MASH* ran for 11 seasons, which is triple the length of the actual Korean War it was based on. It started as a satire, but quickly evolved into something else entirely. A Trojan horse with bandages. The jokes were never just jokes. They were distractions. See, CBS was obsessed with one thing: protecting the American public from so-called indecency. Not violence or war, but words like virgin. You heard that right. The same show that casually portrayed amputated limbs and battlefield death scenes in prime time had to jump through hoops to mention basic human biology. The phrase, "blood everywhere"? Fine. But heaven forbid anyone said virgin out loud. And in 1983, that one word almost derailed everything. That year, the writers pitched an episode called "The Moon Is Not Blue," a cheeky nod to the racy 1953 movie "The Moon is Blue," which was controversial at the time for including the word virgin. The MASH episode followed Hawkeye and BJ as they tried to get their hands on a copy of that exact movie, thinking it would be steamy. Spoiler, it wasn't. But that was the whole point. The writers were poking fun at how ridiculous censorship had become, using the plot to drag CBS's double standards into the light. Now, here's where it gets wild. CBS refused to approve the script. just flat out said no. Not because the episode was graphic or inappropriate, but because the joke relied on the idea of forbidden media. The word virgin, apparently, was still too hot for television, even in satire. So, the writers rewrote it, then rewrote it again. They toned it down and reshaped the joke, but never gave up the fight. And eventually, CBS relented. Sort of. The episode aired, but not without lasting scars. The Moon is Not Blue became a symbol, not just of censorship, but of what it cost to sneak truth into mainstream entertainment. What's even more impressive is how often the writers got away with it. They'd drop controversial jokes during the censors' lunch breaks. They'd bury innuendos in medical jargon so dense that no one could flag it in time. There were visual gags staged in the background of scenes, just out of focus enough to slip by. Even their timing was strategic. Sometimes they'd place an edgy moment after an emotionally heavy scene, knowing the censors would be less likely to trim something that followed a sobering monologue. It was like watching surgeons smuggle forbidden fruit under surgical drapes. Think about that. A show famous for slapstick surgery was actually a masterclass in resistance. And it worked because it never looked like rebellion on the surface. It looked like a sitcom. But the writers weren't just writing comedy. They were smuggling subversion through a 22-minute delivery system, and CBS barely noticed until it was too late. Now, did The Moon is Not Blue take MASH off the air? Not officially. The show ended on its own terms, with a finale that shattered ratings records and made actual history. But that moment, the censorship battle over a single word, marked a turning point. It was the last major clash before the series wrapped, and for many inside the writers' room, it was the final straw. They had pushed the boundary for over a decade. That fight over a PG-rated joke about a PG-rated movie felt like the final confirmation that even clever rebellion has its expiration date. So, which censorship dodge impressed you most? The joke hidden in plain sight, the medical mumbo-jumbo, or the timing trick that beat the lunch bell? And here's the thing, Maz. H didn't survive because it played it safe. It survived because it knew exactly when to poke the bear and when to smile politely. That's the genius. So rewatch it, not as background noise, but with fresh eyes. Look for what they hid in plain sight. And before you go, tell us what you spotted. And remember, the most controversial stories aren't always the ones you see.